That's what this one is about. Tom Geggie. It's Father's Day, 2020. And I wanted to make a video about my father because every around my birthday and around Father's Day, I review. I think about my father and my mother, and I've noticed that since he died 1988, my relationship with him has been getting steadily better. And he is one of my spirit guides. And now I can feel the love for him. Because I was terrified of him and confused from his behavior, but also from other traumas in my childhood. And I spent my lifetime trying to heal those, come to terms with them, be able to embrace them, be able to feel the pain and suffering and everything. And as I cleared that out, then I saw my father more clearly and more compassionately. And, he had many shadows, as his story will perhaps show you. And he had many very endearing qualities. Like all of us, we are much more than just one thing or one person. He was many people. And so I want to tell you his story. Um, his story started in Scotland. His father was a very intelligent guy, but very driven and very traumatized. And his father was a very wealthy, born into a very wealthy family compared to many other people. And my grandfather, rejected his social class, his economic class, and became a stonemason. And he was an idealist and wanted a better world. And he married my grandmother when she was 3 months pregnant. And my grandmother had her parents die, or her mother die when she was very young, which is very traumatic. And her father remarried and had 2 sons. And then my grandmother, was sent to live with maiden aunts and lived as a Cinderella kind of character. And then there's a kind of period where nobody knows about, and suddenly here she is, she's pregnant, she's very good looking. She marries my grandfather, and my father is born on January the 1st, 1900. And he was the first baby born in Scotland in the new century. And he didn't look anything, throughout his whole life, he didn't look anything like my grandmother or like my grandfather. He was actually his polar opposite in many ways. And my grandmother and my father were living right after my father's birth for about 7 years in the worst slum in Europe. It was called the Gorbals. It was in Glasgow. And my grandfather would tour the world and looking for work and adventuring. And he would come back and they would have another child. And so by 1907, I think it was, 1906, the whole family immigrated to Canada, and they lived in poverty. And my grandfather did not like my father and was always criticizing him. And my father was a very insecure guy. He lacked confidence, and yet he was very adventuresome. and my grandfather went into depression, and my father supported the family by selling newspapers. And they were all living in a tiny, tiny, tiny one room, and there were 5 of them. My father and his 2 sisters, and my grandfather and my grandmother. And then my grandfather enlisted to go to World War I, and because he couldn't find work, he hadn't worked for 3 or 4 years. And my father immediately quit school. It was in 1914. And he and my grandmother went to work in factories. My father went into the printing business and was in the printing business until the early 80s. And my father was very, very, very creative and very artistic, and by modern standards, I guess you'd say he had ADHD, although he did manage to learn how to play the piano. And he was always willing to try something new. But his whole focus was out there. He was basically pretending to be confident. And he was a very good-looking man. And because they had been very poor, my grandmother and my father spent a lot of money on clothes and looking good. My father used to say, "Clothes make the man." And he became quite popular in Toronto, and was a very snappy dresser. And by the end of, and he went through many relationships. He was almost married. And then he started hanging out with the high society people. And he was very popular in that world, and he was very quick-witted and funny and nervy and daring, and he went to society parties and played the piano and was pretty active, and didn't tell anybody that he was a printer. So he was kind of ashamed of his roots, and he was very troubled by his relationship with his father. And his father would call him a bastard, and publicly, sometimes when my grandfather was drunk, and call my grandmother a whore. My grandfather increasingly became an alcoholic, but he was also a bon vivant. He was a grand master of a lodge, a Masonic lodge, and became a politician, and was very helped a lot of people, but he also took bribes, and my father was protective of his sisters against his grandfather. And my mother always used to think that my grandfather was abusive in many ways to his whole family, and especially to his daughters. And my father didn't get married until 1937, so he's 37 years old. And people were telling my mother not to marry him because he was from a very dysfunctional, unhappy family. They were known as the grumpy people. And my grandfather's exploits were well known. He would get so drunk and he would do outrageous things. He once stole a streetcar, and my father was embarrassed by this. And even after my grandfather died, just before my father died, he was apologetic about his father and said, no, he wasn't an alcoholic. But my father hid his pain. He held everything inside. And he had incredible illnesses and conditions, and, sometimes couldn't work for long periods of time. We got evicted once from a house that I grew up in. And my father was racked with pain, and he'd be screaming in pain, and he would lash out when he was in pain, or he would lash out when he got drunk. But he couldn't drink very much, thankfully, or very often, because he had stomach ulcers. He was so frightened. And when my father was the manager of a big printing company, the management of the company came and wanted him to do something that my father felt was unethical, and it would involve treating the workers in a bad way, and so he was fired. But then the word spread around the world that here was this master printer manager up for grabs, and there were letters coming in from all over the world when I was a kid during that time, offering my father jobs, and he didn't know what to do. And so the management of the company that he had worked for came and scared him into taking a special position so that the company wouldn't be embarrassed. And my father took it for a very small pension because he was afraid that he was old, that he would be dying, and his family would be destitute. And he was a great provider. I mean, he provided for his family by selling newspapers when he was a kid. And he always would be working an angle or something, or getting something for free, or working very hard to amass money. And of course, when you chase something like that, it doesn't come. So my mother got very sick, he got very sick, and they had huge medical bills. So we lived in not as much poverty as my father had, or my mother, but still it was very hard. And he didn't pay off the medical debts until well into the 1960s. And he did everything because he thought he should do it, or because somebody had told him to do it. And so I didn't like him. I didn't trust him. I didn't respect him. And I held him away. And it was only after he died that I got in touch with the fact that, yes, he'd sexually abused me, but he thought it was okay because that's how he'd been treated. And it was kind of normal in this slum environment where he grew up. And my mother was the same way. They were shocked when I said to them, "I don't want you to do that anymore," to me. And they couldn't understand it. And my father had been beaten himself as a child, and so he thought it was okay. He thought that's what good fathers did, you see, and that's not what good fathers do, but that's just like that Stockholm syndrome, you know. If somebody does bad things to you, you start thinking that it's your fault and not that they're crazy, and you go along with it and you like it. And my father was afraid of dying. He was terrified of dying, and so he made no plans for his old age, and resisted anything, and was determined to live at home. And so here was this guy, he was 88 years old, he'd had cataract operation, and yet he just kept going. And one of the gifts he gave to me, aside from creativity and a quick mouth and a quick mind, and quite an amazing body, is that he taught me perseverance. You just shoulder on. And he did it by internalizing all of his feelings, all of his doubts, all of his pains, and hiding it and being ashamed of it. And I'm lucky enough to have gone the other way and said, no, that when you hide that emotional stuff, it eats away at you inside. And so I've worked my whole life to be more and more and more vulnerable and more transparent. And if you don't like me, then that's given me a degree of considerable freedom. And I've hurt a lot of people because I've been insensitive about my own pain, and that causes me to be insensitive about the pain that I gave to other people, as was true for him. So I'm really sad that I didn't have the presence and skills, interpersonal skills, spiritual skills, intellectual skills that I have now. Because if I had, then I think I would have had a really great time with my dad. He would go out of his way to do stuff. He loved me so much. He was 74 when he actually said it. And I didn't think he did because he did all these crappy things, but he did them because he was afraid. He was afraid I wouldn't be okay. And he wanted to kind of try to keep me safe and behave and follow the status quo, follow the rules, and look good. And of course, I rebelled and didn't care how I looked. And he had a wicked sense of humor, and I can remember arguing with him, screaming at him, and he's screaming at me, and then he would crack a joke in the middle of these things. And I think he helped me have a sense of humor. And I just wish that my father had had the resources that I've had. And I think that in many ways, I was a worse father than my father. I didn't provide for my family. I didn't. I was too self-centered. And only aware of my own, trying to avoid my own suffering. So my son suffered. But my son has turned out to be a grandfather, like a good father. He's not a grandfather yet. And I'm just amazed at what a great father my son is. And my son has the best qualities of my father, and I think some of the best qualities of me, although he's developed his own best qualities, and that's what I think good fatherhood is all about, is that we treat our children and our grandchildren like flowers. You don't know which way they're going to grow or what they're going to be like, and you don't mold them. You might say, well, if you go over here, you'll get more sunlight, but it's up to you. And that didn't mean that I completely didn't intervene at times in my son's growth and development, and sometimes it was good and sometimes that intervention was bad. My father kind of gave up on me when I started drinking, and at a very young age. And he just didn't know what to do when I would be having problems. And in retrospect, I can see that he was aware of it, but he was never able to sit down and say, hey, kid, you look pretty unhappy. Like, this drinking stuff must be make you feel good or you wouldn't keep doing it. But please teach me how your drinking makes you feel good. And eventually I quit drinking and then I'm able to, socially have a little bit, but it's nothing like it was when I was a kid, a teenager, an adult. So my tribute is my thank you very much, Tom Geggie, for being my father. You are a major resource to me now. I take great joy in all of the things that you did that were really outstanding, and that you you created a life for me and for my mom and for yourself against all odds in many ways. And you showed me how to be adventuresome and curious and funny, and to keep on, and to be really creative. This guy was a problem solver, and he was very interested in his mind, and using his mind in very strange ways. And so he taught himself things like hypnosis. And if he had a problem, like at work, he would go to sleep, and he would program his consciousness to come up with solutions by the next morning. And that's something I'm very grateful to him for. And he also loved people, and he would go out of his way to help people. And he became a Grand Master of a lodge, and was very active during the Depression and helping people. And he was very kind to the, well, I don't know if this is true, but a lot of people said that he was very kind to the people around him, and especially to the people who were working for him. He was very considerate, and yet very firm, and very loyal to the company. So Thomas Geggie, thanks for being my dad, and thanks for being in my life. And to all of you, I hope you make a video or something about your dad. And maybe, I used to think, gee, I wish my dad had been like this, and I wish my dad had been like that, and I wish my dad had been like Mr. Doyle, my friend Mike Doyle's father, or this father or that father. But now I'm really happy my dad was my dad. He did the best he could, and it was pretty terrific. I had very few days where I didn't have food, and I always had a home to go to, which my son has not always been able to do. I think I lived in 3 places from the time I was born till when I left home, and they were simple place, but they were. It was the best that my mom and dad could pull off, and I was not able, through my instabilities, to provide that for my son, and I'm very, very sorry. However, my son has rectified that, and my son and his wife have rectified that. And they have given their children a lot of stability. And kids need that. But I wouldn't be who I am if I hadn't had this instability and the consequences of that, and then learning to resolve it. And so now I've been living in the same place for 20 years with my sweetheart. And I finally learned to have relationships, because I didn't know how to have relationships. My childhood was too confusing for that to happen. So thank you for watching, and happy Father's Day to all the fathers. And we've all been fathers. I don't know if you believe in incarnation, but there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot being discovered about all those things if you want to learn them. So thanks a lot for watching. Bye.